Ωραία. Σας καλωσορίζω στη σημερινή συνάντηση του σεμιναρίου μας για τη λογική του νοήματος. Είναι η τέταρτη συνάντηση για φέτος και εγώ κάνω μια μικρή εισαγωγή για να δώσω το λόγο αρχικά στον Αντώνη που θα κάνει για σήμερα το συντονισμό. Είναι μέλος της ομάδας μας και επιστημονικός συνεργάτης αυτή τη στιγμή του Τμήματος Αρχαιολογίας της Οξφόρδης και ο οποίος θα προλογίσει και θα συντονίσει τη σημερινή συζήτηση με κύρια ομιλήτρια, τη Δωροθέα Ολκόφσκι, μία που έχουμε την τιμή να την ακούσουμε σήμερα, μεγάλη ερευνήτρια και σπουδαία του έργου του Ντελέζ και αυτή τη στιγμή καθηγήτρια φιλοσοφίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Κολοράντο στην Αμερική. Ο λόγος λοιπόν, Αντώνη, σε σένα.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ναι, θα ήθελα να προσθέσω και εγώ ότι ναι, η Δωροθέα δεν χρειάζεται ιδιαίτερες συστάσεις. Είναι μεγάλη φιγούρα της Ντελεζιανής σκέψης. Οπότε, εντελώς επιγραμματικά, να αναφέρουμε ότι είναι καθηγήτρια φιλοσοφίας και διευθύντρια γνωστικών σπουδών στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Κολοράντο. Και είναι και συγγραφέας περισσότερων από 100 άρθρων και 14 βιβλίων. Με ιδιαίτερη αδυναμία πέρα από τον Ντελέζ φυσικά και στον Μπεργκσόν, τον Μερλό Ποντί και πιο πρόσφατα και στον Τζαρλς Πέρς. Επίσης εδώ να προσθέσω ότι οι ερωτήσεις ιδανικά που θα γίνουν στο δεύτερο στάδιο της σημερινής ομιλίας να γίνονται στα αγγλικά. Αν κάποιο προτιμάει να την κάνει στα ελληνικά, μπορεί να την γράψει στο chat, θα τη μεταφράσω και θα τη ρωτήσω εγώ. Οπότε αυτά προς το παρόν από μένα και την πάση στη Δωροθέα. Δωροθέα, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and being interested in the work that I have done on this topic. I want to say that I think this is a very difficult book. I've always thought it was a very difficult book, and I spent quite a bit of time the last couple of days reading a couple of special chapters, the 11th on nonsense and the 24th on communication of the event, just in order to reinforce my ideas. And I have this idea, which I could wait to put it out, but I might as well say it now, that it's quite possible that the series in this book, which constitute these disjunctions, each of which has its own life, so to speak, that the way of organizing these ideas is a sort of preliminary step to what Deleuze eventually does in Mille Plateaux, in 1,000 Plateaus. I think the structure of these dualities, not dualisms, but dualities, these that work together and only in relationship to one another. I think that it's quite possible that Deleuze continues this with Guattari in Mille Plateaux, but you can see what you think of this idea. So it's called 34 New Ways of Expressing Becoming Thinking through the Literary Work of Art and Sexuality. And thanks to Antonis there is a Greek translation on Facebook, I think. I ran it through a translator a translating app that I use quite a lot for my Greek classes. And then sent it to Antonis and Kelly, and I think they made some corrections. Okay, so the first section is called Why Literature? Why Sense? In his comprehensive book on Deleuze and language, Jean-Jacques Leclerc makes note of Gilles Deleuze's opposition to linguistics as a system in equilibrium, a simple machine like an incline or pulley, an object of science whose variations arise only in expression. By contrast, writers of literature know that language can be a system in perpetual imbalance, a system affected by forces moving it, so that literature is on par with or superior to linguistics. I think this is an important theme in this book. and only literature and not linguistics is adequate to the needs of philosophers. This does not mean, however, metaphor. So we will see in a moment what it does mean. Much of Deleuze's critique of linguistics is directed towards the imperialism of the signifier. The signifier is that part of the sign which refers to a state of affairs, its qualities and real relations, so that a word comes to be associated with an image that ought to represent that state of affairs. So we're dealing with representation. And it is against the notion of the signifier as a representation transcending that which it represents that Deleuze proposes a logic of sense. It is against linguistics that Deleuze will propose not an alternative linguistics, that is not what he wants, but a logic of sense manifest in the literary work of art and in sexuality. Of course, the question, what is a logic of sense? Deleuze's book, The Logic of Sense, is a volume, very simply, consisting of 34 series plus appendices. The series in The Logic of Sense cover topics in language, logic, of course, and psychoanalysis that are somewhat surprising in their range and seemingly unrelated from a common sense point of view. These topics include the nature of the linguistic proposition, the relation between bodies and language, the logical categories of connection, conjunction, and disjunction, which are actually central to the entire book, nonsense, good sense, and common sense, the transcendental field, representation, event, time, sexuality, and thought itself. In his very brief preface, Deleuze says little to inform us readers regarding the generation of series and the purpose of a logic of sense, revealing only that it stands in relation to a work of literature and a school of philosophy. Revising the order of time, Deleuze titles the preface From Lewis Carroll to the Stoics. And at first, it appears as if Carroll's famous children's books, called Books for Little Girls, are in fact the starting point of Deleuze's thinking about the logic of sense. There is, we are told, the immediate pleasure of, among other things, logical and linguistic formalism and a profound psychoanalytic content. I have another paper on Alice and addressing Deleuze's treatment of Alice called, forget the title of it, but I can think of it before the end, After Alice. It's called After Alice. And it deals with Carroll as a logician and what I think he was attempting to do as a logician and as a philosopher of language in that book, and not as a storytelling. I mean, it's a somewhat different take than Deleuze's, although I do use Deleuze in that paper. There is, we are told, the immediate pleasure of, among other things, logical and linguistic formalism and a profound psychoanalytic content. Yet Carroll's book is said to contain something that is over and above all of this. It contains a play of sense and nonsense, consummated in the, quote, marriage of language and the unconscious. So it's a really important connection here. Although the playful language games of Lewis Carroll seem to be commensurate with a general Deleuzean framework, we might be surprised to find Deleuze engaging with psychoanalysis. I mean, not really, but some people are. But if we follow the advice of Jean-Jacques Leclerc, let us not dismiss this too quickly, but follow it out to see what its implications might be. That is, what is this consummated marriage of language and the unconscious? And that's really the clue, right? The unconscious, sense and nonsense. And in what manner do these terms form series, and what exactly is new about such series and systems? I have, by the way, found myself writing quite a lot of papers on creation, creativity, and the new. This may have been the start of that because it's something that people are quite interested in. And I find it quite difficult Series, as the author has written in another work, are constituted by the differences between each of the terms that enter into them. Two or more series can generate a system when they communicate under the impetus of a force of some kind. That would be some differentiator that relates differences in the series to one another. These relations are called couplings, and they can be derived from internal resonances and oscillations between these series. So there's quite a lot of communication here. On the surface of it, these explanations make a sort of sense. They use the language we've come to expect from Deleuze, but the question remains, what is a system that calls for series and a logic of sense? What's the role of the 34 series? How can something be generated by the differences between each of the terms that enters into them? And what is this something that is generated? To make sense of sense, let's begin by investigating the idea of difference and the differences that give rise to series in the logic of sense. One of the ways Deleuze does this is to adapt the principles of mathematics. I'm sorry, but this is what he's doing. The principles of mathematical vector fields to language. So he uses it as a model, and it's a very convenient model for him. And it's not a model that he actually ever gives up, although he releases himself from it more and more in Mille Plateau and even in What is Philosophy. A vector field is defined by Deleuze as the complete determination of a problem. So that's the important thing, a complete determination of problem, given in terms of the existence, number, and distribution of points or elements or possibly events that are its condition. The rules that govern this field, as I said earlier, are logical rules, and you find them, of course, in Kant, you find them in Aristotle. Rules of association or connection, commutation or disjunction, and distribution, conjunction. And you're familiar with these. Kant uses them in the Critique of Pure Reason in order to derive his table of judgments. And Kant says that he himself takes them from Aristotle. So the rules of association, commutation, and distribution define this vector space without reference to magnitudes, that is size, or direction. So they can be used, importantly, in a variety of areas whose terms are not material or physical. And that's why they're useful for Deleuze, right? Because he can use them not to talk about physical states of affairs, but to talk about language. And this allows us to apply these principles to language and to find in them a logic of sense, to derive from them and in relationship to them this so-called logic of sense. The rules governing these fields have their equivalents in logic, as I said, where association is an expression of logical equivalence. It permits the valid regrouping of simple propositions. It governs the relations, that is, the connections between subject and predicate, right? S, some S is P, et cetera, et cetera. Commutation allows for the valid reordering of inclusive, disjunctive, either or statements. And in categorical propositions, distribution of a term is permitted if it refers to all members of a class. In logic, this would be expressed as conjunction or connection. The rule of the generation of this field is commutative. What that means is that statements may initially be combined in any order, which reflects a certain element of freedom, yes? If a field such as language is generated by rules whose immanent regulative functions follow these logical rules of so that they are associative, commutative, and distributive, each of these as mathematical or logical operations reflects a view of this field as importantly, the power of things to exist one by one without any possibility of them being gathered together in a transcendent unity. And that's the important element for Deleuze, right? They cannot be gathered together in a transcendent unity. Instead, they are connected immanently as differential relationships. So he uses them differentially. He is not going to use them to establish a transcendent, unified linguistics. With this, we can start to see a little bit how the logic of sense is formulated in terms of a series of linguistic, spatial, and temporal paradoxes. And these paradoxes end up being an extremely important aspect. They are incredibly important to logic. As I said at the beginning, Russell's, for my taste, for me, Lewis Carroll's entire Alice in Wonderland is in fact a book about logical paradoxes. So this is very important, I think, in Deleuze's mind as he's thinking about this. Making sense of sense requires a foray into language itself, of course. Although Gottlieb Frege's famous account, according to Gottlieb Frege's famous account of sense and reference, which is extremely important to keep always in the background here, it's natural to think that for any given sign, such as a word, there is a reference. The reference of the word evening star is exactly the same as that for the words morning star. The sense, however, of each of these two signs is not the same. The best that Frege can say about sense is that opinions as to the sense of any sign may vary, and that terms such as the celestial body furthest from the earth may have a sense, but certainly it has no reference, at least not one that we can designate. Moreover, the same sense is not always connected with the same associated idea, and not even for the same person. So Frege defines this as an internal image arising from memories of sensory impressions, which are often saturated with feelings. And we may be surprised to find Frege talking about this, but it is extremely important to him. In short, the reference of a sign is the object itself, and the idea is wholly subjective, and the sense is somewhere in between those two in this loose realm for Frege. So this is somewhat problematic for Deleuze's approach, as we'll see. But it points out the difficulties encountered in attempting to define and understand sense. And they don't end by distinguishing it from reference. That's only a start. If one is satisfied with only the idea or the thought, there's no need to go beyond sense to reference. But Frege says, we're not satisfied with the thought and the sense wherever we are concerned with truth value, because of course Frege is concerned with truth value, with truth. So for him, works of art such as poetry and literature, and that's important for us because that's what Deleuze is going to in order to generate his linguistics, right, his logic of sense. The difference between sense and reference is a difference between aesthetic delight and scientific investigations. It has question of the images. Works such as poetry and literature are of interest, says Frege, only with respect to the sense of their sentences and the images and feelings they give rise to. Thus, we are driven into accepting the truth value of a sentence as constituting its reference. And this is Frege's unique pull away, right? Every declarative sentence concerned with the reference of its words must be either true or false, and insofar as the truth value of a sentence is its reference. So for Frege, reference becomes actually a question of true and false. All true sentences have the same references, truth, and all false sentences have the same reference, false. In this way, we can see that true and false for Frege obliterate anything and everything specific, and that true and false propositions are often concerned with what is defined as judgment, that is, with passing from thought to the reference. Now, Deleuze's own take on the proposition is instructive. He treats it as a trajectory, a curve, where association, and that's the mathematical model, right, of the trajectory in a mathematical space. Association, commutation, and distribution imminently determine the field within which the propositions are generated as a series. Deleuze begins with a restatement of the standard account of the nature of the proposition as found, for example, in the work of Bertrand Russell. And throughout his work, Deleuze is very concerned with what Russell has to say. It is my contention that Bergsonism, which is a term coined by Russell, not by Deleuze, and not by the Bergsonians, like Merleau-Ponty, for example, Bergsonism is an attempt to wrest Russell's account of Bergson from Russell and from analytic philosophy. So Russell is always plays an important role in Deleuze's work. Using slightly different terminology than Frege, Russell argues that language serves three purposes. One, to indicate facts. Two, to express the state of the speaker. And three, to alter the state of the hearer. And these will be important for Deleuze. In addition, every assertion has a subjective function, that is the expression of the speaker's beliefs, and it has an objective function, the indication of some fact, something that is true or false. That's what a fact is. True and false sentences are taken to be equally significant, but if a string of words does not express the state of the speaker, meaning her beliefs, then it is nonsense and will have no impact on the hearer. And that's the first indication of nonsense, the first definition we have of it, Russell's. With respect to the first function, Deleuze states that when the proposition relates to an external state of affairs, we simply call this denotation. No problem. The denoting intuition associates words with images that represent the state of affairs. Representation. The words that denote are not universals, but pure designators or indexicals. Thus, context dependent. They are context dependent in the following sense. True means the denotation is fulfilled by a state of affairs, false that it is not. With respect to Russell's second function, expressing the state of a speaker, Deleuze utilizes the concept of manifestation. It refers either to the internal causality of an image with respect to an object or state of affairs, the desire for that object, or to the external causality of a state of affairs, the belief in its existence. Concerning the notion of altering the state of the hearer, Deleuze is initially silent. He doesn't really speak about it here. Instead, he passes on to signification. Frege's judgment, which is passing from thought to referent by means of an inference that places a proposition under universal or general concepts. This, of course, requires minimally the conditional inference called logical implication. Implication involves some kind of causality. If P, then Q, where P is the condition under which a proposition Q would be true. As Russell noted, the proposition may be false if it designates a non-existing state of affairs. Thus, signification always raises the possibility of error, meaning the causal relation, whether internal or external, may not hold. Within the domain of language, within the low language system, the realm of propositions without speakers or listeners, subjects or objects, signification is, of course, primary. You might say, without subjects or objects, only signification exists. Without signification, that is, without universal or general concepts, that's what we mean here, Deleuze maintains the causality of desire would evaporate into need, and that of belief would evanesce into opinion, neither of which requires a concept. An interesting and provocative claim on his part. As necessary as inference may be, it leads to a delicate problem. In logic, association is the expression of logical equivalence, permitting valid regrouping of simple propositions, the connections between subjects and predicates. Given a hypothetical, if P then Q, it consists in a relation between two propositions, proposition P, proposition Q, which can be reformulated using truth tables to arrive at its logically valued equivalent. Sorry, I lost my place. Not P or Q. This valid logical reformulation has remarkable consequences. Not P or Q. It separates or tears apart the causal order of the inference, making it possible to reorder the propositions, to disturb their causal linearity, transforming causality into disjunct. As Deleuze expresses this, the conclusion can be detached from the premises. And the result is that implication does not actually ground denotation, that rather there is circularity between ground and grounded. And in general, this is his critique of analytic philosophy of language, that it is entirely circular from beginning to end, which is why he wants a fourth element, which is sense, in order to be able to step away from that circularity. It's this problem in particular that leads Deleuze to a logic of sense, a fourth dimension of the proposition, sense as the expressed of a proposition. He attributes it, of course, to the Stoics, to writers of literature such as Lewis Carroll, who are not satisfied with words, things, images, and he attributes it also to a version of psychoanalysis. Sense is neither a logical nor a linguistic category. It's attributable to neither a subject nor an object. It is rather the boundary between propositions and things. It is that boundary between what is said, right, and states of affairs, if you will, an expression of the paradoxes created by signification, turning every if-then into or. In other words, following the mathematical model, the boundary determines what takes place on either side, that there is a boundary. And the boundary condition is the paradoxical element. Just having this proposition, right, having this expression that goes in two directions simultaneously, that boundary is the paradoxical element. It is the affirmation of two opposing directions at once. Not contradiction, right? No contradiction there, but paradox. Paradox is, and I'm going to bring Hannah Arendt into this for reasons I'll explain momentarily. Paradox is, as Hannah Arendt once noted, the inherent condition of being a living being who is part of the world of appearance, but simultaneously possessed of a mind that may withdraw from the world in order to think, even while remaining immanent to that world. I would say that this is the case for Deleuze. And thinking, it is clear, is language-based, leading to the problem of how to have a system of language that is not linguistics, but that emerges as sense out of the literary work of art and out of sexuality. In order to get a better view of sense and to understand the paradox produced by the coincidence of appearance and thinking, let's step aside for a moment and follow the model proposed by Lusset to participate in a philosophical interlude, an interlude suggested by Arendt's definition. Now, I often bring Arendt into my account of Deleuze, and I do it for two reasons. One is that I think that the ideas are very similar, except that she often explains it in a much more direct clear manner. Secondly, because, and I have no way to prove this, I have the impression, and I've had this for years, that Deleuze read Arendt and that he took a lot from her. And he never cites her anywhere that I've found, but it's there. It's everywhere. So this clarifies on the one hand in a way that makes it a little bit easier to get to what Deleuze is after, but it also adds an element that I think is important. In The Life of the Mind, Volume 1, Thinking, Arendt focuses on the thinking ego in relationship to its sheer thinking activity. That is so Deleuzian. It's folly, she insists, to conclude from our experience of the activity of thought that there are things in themselves which exist in the intelligible sphere in the same manner as we exist in the world of appearances. Nevertheless, this semblance of reason persists. It's incorrect, but persists. The question arises, is this caused by dogmatic beliefs and arbitrary assumptions that disappear on inspection, or is it somehow inherent in the paradoxical condition of a living being who is part of the world of appearance, but possesses a mind that may withdraw from that world without being able to leave or transcend it? And it's possible, although I haven't done this careful look, that every series in the Logic of Sense embodies this, precisely this disposition, right? This paradox between these two manners of being, if you will, of existing. The problem may be stated simply. Thinking can seize every object except its own thoughts, and this gives rise to doubts about the reality of the world, a reality we call appearance. Reality, she reasons, consists of a worldly context of perceptions and perceivers whose senses are working together. This is, she notes, why art is not exactly a reality. That is, works of art transform sense objects into thought things by tearing them, first of all, out of their sensible context to derealize them and prepare them for a new function, a function related to Deleuze's logic of sense. Is it not the case, she asks, that a pure thinking thing, an ego cogito, without a body and sense, would not even know that there is such a thing as reality and could not distinguish between various states in the realm of appearance? Thus, the fact that each object appears in a different perspective to each individual is not a barrier, and that's an important consideration. It is rather a fundamental indication of the similarities between sense-endowed perceivers that gives rise to the general sensation of reality, which Arendt refers to as the sixth sense, or le bon sens, good sense. Unlike whatever is present to the senses, thought withdraws. It withdraws from sensibles to think invisibles. Thus, intellect is in the world, immanent, we may say, and grasps what is given to the senses, searching for the truth of that given, but only reason understands its meaning. The ancient Greeks spoke of truths of reason, such as mathematical reasoning, meaning something necessary, whose opposite is impossible, and they differentiated this from truths of fact, which are contingent and whose opposite is possible. But insofar as a distinction can be made between truth and meaning, and there are no truths above factual truths that are scientifically verifiable, and to expect truth to come from thinking is to confuse the need to think with the urge to know. So when thinking is employed by knowing, it is only as the handmaiden of science. Of course, thinking is as important as knowing, and without the need to think, we would lose the capacity to produce thought things, Arendt's word, by the way, such as works of visual and literary art. Although in and of itself, thinking leaves nothing tangible in its wake. Still, the distinction formulated so carefully by Kant between knowledge that uses thinking and thinking that arises out of and only in relation to reason was undermined by Kant's constant comparison of them. So like Deleuze, she is critical of this aspect of Kant. As Deleuze expresses this, Kant allows the objects of undetermined ideas to be determined by analogy with objects of experience. But the I that thinks is not the ego that experiences time and is determined in time, and so should not be confused with it. So that's one of the series in the logic of sense, precisely that. The I think should be forever split from the I am, an analogy, which is to say metaphor, importantly, thereby disappears from thinking and from literature, even from literature. Moreover, where truth, not meaning, is the ultimate criterion of mental activities, we may speak only of deception and illusion. And this Kant is right only if reason as the faculty of speculative thought does not move in the world of appearances. In the world of thought, reason produces sense and nonsense, but never illusion and deception, which belong only to common sense and sensation. Sense and nonsense belong to thinking, and thinking alone, by which we mean that realm that has been pulled out of the sensible and transformed into thought things in the work of art. So we have the motivation for a logic of sense and nonsense. It's a logic that operates solely in the realm of thinking and never in the realm of appearances. So given this, what characteristics might we look for in a logic of sense? This, of course, must be strongly correlated with another question. What makes us think? The autonomy of mental activities implies that they are unconditioned, that they exceed existential limits, that they are pure activity that can be started and stopped at will, that mind is the master of its own activities and those of the passions as well. This is a theory, Arendt points out, that reached its climax with the Stoics, who tended to equate soul with mind. Yet thinking always transcends what is given by transforming it into an experiment of self with self. And so its thinking implies withdrawing from the world. It came to be associated with death. Thinking cannot come to be into being except by withdrawing from the world's being present to the senses, even though the mind must retain an intuition, making present what is absent. This means that thinking desenses. It transforms the visible world into invisible images. Valorizing thinking above all else, the philosopher turns common sense upside down, absenting even her own body, as well as spatial and temporal distinctions. Only logical reasoning, where the mind is in strict consistency with its own laws, produces a deductive chain from a given premise and cuts all strings to living experience, because the premise is supposed to be self-evident and not subject to examination by thought. Nevertheless, from the perspective of thinking, life in its utter there-ness is meaningless. While from the perspective of life and the senses, thinking is living death. I'm thinking here about what Deleuze says about Nietzsche, health and sickness, in the chapter on, I think it's in the one on the communication of the event. This is strongly reflective in what he says there about Nietzsche, health and sickness. Maybe it's in the other chapter, I forgot. So, nevertheless, from the perspective of thinking, life in its other there-ness is meaninglessness, while from the perspective of life and the senses, thinking is living death. The philosopher appears to embrace this death. And this is made more problematic by the limitations inherent in the realm of the ideas of reason. In the realm of ideas, no metaphors illuminate this activity, because all metaphors are taken from the senses and are merely cognitive. They exist for the sake of knowledge. They're instruments for dealing with the world. They do not express the sheer activity of the mind, the sheer activity of thought. And it is this sheer activity that Deleuze is attempting to formulate with the logic of sense, out of literature and sexuality, but on the condition that meaning be nothing other than use, that it become a firm principle only if we have at our disposal imminent criteria capable of determining legitimate uses. So what about the legitimate uses of sense? Stoicism is a poetic way of life. It asks us not to be unworthy of what happens to us, to accept war, wounds, and death. In fact, to long for death as an apotheosis of the will. If thinking or sense is reason's need to actualize itself, it is just as much the will willing itself to will. It is pure activity. There must be an exchange of the organic, physical will for the spiritual will. The event whose splendor and magnificence is sense. But the actualization of reason, will, or judgment takes place paradoxically, that is, in two opposed directions at once, which then form a series as they resonate in the vicinity of one another. Resonance is created by the constructive interference of the two waves which travel in opposite directions in a medium. Sense is a system oriented in one direction toward appearance and in the other toward pure becoming, pure activity of spiritual life. In one direction, that which can be known, that which receives the action of the idea, and on the other, that which outruns it in ceaseless spiritual activity. In one direction, language fixes limits by naming. In the other direction, unlimited becoming. The resonance of these two directions produces a remarkable result. The system undergoes reversals everywhere, cause and effect before and after, more and less, resulting in the loss of ability to give names to things, employing paradox everywhere to disrupt good sense with its arrow of time and common sense, the fixing of identities, all to affirm becoming. And this is a lot of what's happening to Alice when she goes to Wonderland. So all to affirm becoming the spiritual will. Of course, there are still bodies with their mixtures and states of affairs, causes of other bodies. But now there are also incorporeal entities, events with sense, that is, logical attributes, dividing or differentiating themselves, as argued above, by transforming every causal relation, every if-then, into or. It is in this manner that everything seems to happen at the boundary between things and propositions, bodies and the incorporeal. A sense does not exist outside of the proposition that expresses it in the act of denoting the thing or state of affairs. If language is fixated on denotation, manifestation, or signification, the traditional categories of linguistics, it remains in the realm of the true and the false. This will not be literary language. It will not be the language of spiritual life, what are sometimes called pure flows. Literary language expresses ideal events, sets of singularities or singular points, characterizing mathematical curves, that is, a physical state of affairs, a psychological and moral person. Singularities are unique mathematical points in vector fields. Recall Deleuze's use of calculus and the definition of a vector field as the complete determination of a problem given in terms of the existence, number, and distribution of points that are its condition. And we can see these fields fill up, right, as he articulates this. So we can see this as the sense of sense, the direction in which it takes us. The field precedes its actualizations, but it gets filled with them. In this manner, it is pre-individual. It is non-personal. It is a-conceptual. It is absolutely indifferent to the individual and to the collective, the personal and the impersonal, the particular and the general, and to their opposites. Here we can say that it is entirely the manner in which unlimited becoming is connected, that is associated, conjoined, that is distributed, and disjoined, that is commuted. It is this, the manner in which these things happen that determines whether it forms human subjects, works of art, or social institutions. In both, literature and sexuality are generated and generate language in relation to the rules governing this mathematics of singular points and a physics of intensive quantities. In the literature of Lewis Carroll, we find events formed in series whose sequence may be reversed or displaced, or oscillating between reality and dream, denotation and expression. Things happen, and then they just as easily can happen in reverse, right? The child turns into a pig. It could just as easily turn back into a child. The queen yells off with their head, and absolutely nothing happens. Esoteric words are formed in connective syntheses that contract the syllabic element of a single proposition. Urence, for your Royal Highness, or in conjunctive syntheses of two series of heterogeneous propositions, or through the denotative and expressive dimension of propositions, the equivocity of the word it, in the sequence with the dodo and the duck, right? Where I think it's the duck who just wants to know what it means, right? Because for him, it refers to, for the duck, it refers to a concrete person or thing. Or in the synthesis of disjunction, connoting two series, such as the denotable and the sense-bearing. Neither the series fuming and plus furious equals fuming, nor the series fuming plus furious equals furious, but only fuming plus furious equals frumious, the disjunction between the first two series. So this is how, right, Lewis Carroll connects these things and creates this language. But prior to literary language, in the genesis of sexuality, the three syntheses of the vector fields first create language. And although it is a bit tricky to connect the embodied depth of sexuality with its surface, nevertheless, Deleuze boldly declares that regardless of what's happening in the depths of bodies, their symptoms are manifest on the surface in the serial form of sexuality in bodies without organs, that is the pure surface, or words without articulations, that is no depths. These symptoms or blocks of becoming are organized as surface phenomena, and different moments of sexuality correspond to different kinds of series on that surface: connective, conjunctive, disjunctive. Erogenous zones are first generated through connective series in the pregenital field, where objects of sucking and images of the oral zone become coextensive to and explore the orifices of the surface. As connective, every erogenous element is homogeneous. It is contracted into a connective synthesis of succession. In other words, polymorphous perversity is all. But out of this emerges a second synthesis, conjunctively subsuming the first. Images like mother and father that had merely been connected, mother, father that had merely been connected are now conjoined as mother and father. The conjoined parental image emerges out of homogeneous succession, and now it is distributed everywhere, and it converges around the field circumscribed by the Oedipal image of the phallus. Disjunctive synthesis, a logical inversion of conjunction, the formal power to separate what had been conjoined, works on the conjoined images in the field organized by the good object, that is the unification of whatever is disjoined, which is lost and withdrawn into the heights. In this field is generated the id, ego, and superego out of the good object's distribution of love or hate. Its effects hold if either one or both of its elements hold. Thus, this is its power. And here one finds the strongest effects where the nonsense noise of the body, that is the id, clashes with the voice that speaks the idea, the superego, on the surface of the ego, where language is born, the body without organs. This is the genesis of the event language from the psychoanalytic field for Deleuze. In both instances, the promise that sense fulfills is to be the meeting place of appearance and thinking, beings and pure becoming, but only through bringing the symptoms of depth into the organization of the surface, generating literature and language out of the paradoxes created in their clash. The loss of sensibility is, it seems, the price we must pay for the new. And this is something that concerns me. And yet, let's not forget Arendt's words on this. In all appearance, the ground does not appear. That is, our bodily organs, our neurophysiology, our sensibilities. All we sense are inner sensations whose relentless succession prevents them from assuming a lasting identifiable shape. An unbroken sensation or mood would indicate a grave disorder, such as depression or mania. In spite of the Kantian claims that what appears must have grounds that do not appear, things in themselves, the fundamental ground of the appearing world is not the sheer activity of thinking, which is becoming, but it is our organs, our inner depths. As pure thinking thing without a body, a pure thinking thing without a body would not know that there is a reality or distinction such as awake, asleep, to eat, to speak. Thinking is without a natural relation to reality. And in withdrawing from the realm of the sensible, it withdraws from the feeling of realness. In short, the primacy of what is produced by our sensibility and appears to us over what does not appear at all must be considered. For no one has ever succeeded in living in pure becoming, and there is no pure becoming without sensibility and appearance. Thus, while we may not wish to empower linguistics, we might still ask about the limits of sense, its longing for death, its rejection of sensibility. For a philosophy of the new might also, it seems, consider that without sensibility and the effects of it, that is appearance, the pure becoming of thought disappears once and for all. Thanks, thank you. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dorothea, for that very interesting series of thoughts. It can certainly give rise to many lines of light. As tradition has it, I'll pass the ball to Chloe first, and then we'll be happy to take questions. Chloe?
I want to thank you, Dorothea, for your excellent presentation. I found the final part in the same moment passionate and impassive, and this brings out, show out the poetry that is included in Deleuze thinking. Θα ήθελα όμως πριν συνεχίσουμε να πω ότι έχουμε ανάμεσά μας, έχουμε τη χαρά να έχουμε ανάμεσά μας στην ομιλία της Δωροθέας την καθηγήτρια Άννα Χρονάκη και τον καθηγητή Κανάκη Λελεδάκη, που ελπίζω να μας δώσουν τις επόμενες παρουσιάσεις σε αυτό το σεμινάριο. Και τώρα γυρίζω σε σένα, Αντώνη, και δεν ξέρω αν η Δωροθέα wish to have an intermission of 2 or 3 minutes, or we proceed as we are.
No, I'm okay. We can just go ahead.
Okay, great. So we have one question from Yanis. Yanis, do you wanna? It's in English. I can see it in the chat box. Do you want to ask it, or should I go ahead and read it?
Dorothea, thank you very much. I'm processing these things. Some are difficult for me, but thank you very, very much. I will read again and again this text and analysis. But I'm not very sure my internet is very well, I don't know, connected. So that's why I've written it. I've written this text. Can you hear me well?
Yes, and I can see your question in the chat if you'd like me to just address that. Is that good? Okay, thank you.
Whatever you prefer.
So the word desenses in this context is not the logica sense, it's sensation. And I think that what Arendt is saying is not that different from what Deleuze is saying, right? That is precisely what you find happening in the two elements of the series. They form a disjunct, and yet you affirm both. It's very clear. Both are affirmed, even though they remain disjunctive. Because if they don't remain disjunctive, if you combine them, right, then you lose precisely the resonance and the tension and the distinction between them, and each of them loses their independence, so to speak. So there's a sense in which I think Deleuze's logic of sense, and this just occurred to me, is to a certain extent doing away with the whole idea of reference, or sidelining it in any case, right? And illuminating and focusing on the all series as this distinction or the disjunct between two elements, right? That neither of them are taken to be referential, and each of them, right, has a capacity to become elaborated and more elaborated, always disjoint, but always resonating in relationship to one another. And that's why there's a boundary. They're not just completely free from one another, right? They're not free from one another. There always is a boundary. On the one hand, there's the turn towards language and words. And on the other hand, there's the turn towards sensibility, states of affairs, whatever. But neither of them are engaging in reference, because to do so would be to limit their capacity for creation in both aspects, right? To tie them to reference, to tie them to denotation, would be to limit their capacity for creating something new in literature or with respect to the body. So, and each of the series, I would say, in the logic of sense, takes up one element of this, right? A series of two concepts that are disjoined from one another, and each of which, right, is carries out its carried as far as it can be in terms of the creation of something new. But the moment you tie them to reference, then you stop that process.
Perfect. Anyone else? Any questions? Yanni, do you wanted to answer something before we move on to the next question? And then Zana.
Can you please say again the last sentence? I've lost it.
You want
Dorothea, to mention the last sentence. Dorothea, what was that? The final thing you said?
Just now,
Yeah.
that it's that we have these two directions, right? One towards the body, one towards the proposition, if you will, and neither of them can be subjected to reference, to knowledge. To do so, right, is for them to lose their creative power and ability.
Mm.
They must also, even independently, as he points out with psychoanalysis, right, the independent terms mother and father should not be conjoined as mother and father and then situated, for example, within the Oedipal structure. But one can still have this terminology, mother, father, right? But it simply cannot be subjugated to the signification, to the field organized by Oedipus and by the Oedipal understanding. And it would be the same with literature, although it's a little bit harder. He doesn't actually hear until he doesn't really discuss literature as carefully until you get to the appendices. And well, Alice, of course. Alice is an interesting case because Alice is literature, Alice is logic. And as I said, I think that every single adventure that Alice has in Lewis Carroll's hands is an adventure that reflects some logical paradox. And many of them had not yet even been clearly stated when Charles Dobson wrote about them, when Lewis Carroll wrote them in this book, but all of them became eventually discussed, Russell paradox, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that the piece of literature is about working out, that piece of literature is about working out the paradoxes of logic, which again, because it happens underground, where causal relations are undone, and causal relations are normative in states of affairs, right? So because they happen in a world where causality and causal relationships no longer hold, they operate in a very different way as logical formulations and as literary formulations as well, I would suppose, but I do read them as logical formulations.
Thank you very much. Anna?
Γεια σας, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Γεια σου, Δωροθέα. Hello, hi. It's very nice to see you here, and what a wonderful talk. Very dense. I think I need to to listen to it a few times.
I'm not sure I understand it.
But so many things in there. Yeah, I've got some questions that came to my mind from what you said. First of all, if we think that Deleuze is writing the logic of sense in the 60s, I think, isn't it? And that's about the time that the Bourbaki school is on, the Bourbaki school, that tries to create an axiomatization of mathematics, of logic and group theory, in order to create a royal science. So could we see, for example, this attempt, that it is also an attempt, a political attempt, a politics from the side of the philosopher to show, to actually counter this axiomatic royal science that was created by these groups of people at that particular period in the 60s, because the 60s is a very particular period that science plays a very major role in many different things around the world. Science becomes a very important, and also the way that axiomatic science is organized within that particular circles of mathematicians, like the Bourbaki school, becomes a program that is appropriated even in the education of the masses of people. An education that through the Marshall Project for citizenship for all and blah, 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 opening things for all in brackets. So they bring Bourbakian ideas for everybody in the masses. So here we have, for example, Deleuze using a little girl who actually points out that here we can do some different things with mathematics. It's not only this particular thing that becomes opened for everybody in schools, in curricula for everybody, not only a politics, but even an educational policy that was existent also in our times in Greece and in everywhere in many kind of developing countries. So this idea, this political idea of mathematics is not one, or that mathematics is not only a royal axiomatic science, but it's many other different things comes through here, through this text. And it's quite important of how we can reconnect with mathematics, I think, as a way that is not linguistic, or neither linguistic, neither axiomatic from the mathematical point of view. So I'm wondering if you have any comments about that, the connections to this, to these developments which were happening aside. And the second related question is how this program speaks today in a time that we discuss a lot about post-truth. So how does that program today engage us into the discussion of the post-truth issues? And the third related to that is how this work is related to what Guattari brought with the asignification, the asignified. Because asignified was something that mainly was developed by Guattari. So I'm thinking, what are the connections here with this program? There must be some connections, I guess, huh? Of course.
Okay. First, the question about truth, because it's fascinating to me that I gave a talk recently on the distinction between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. And that's something that always has fascinated me and continues to be of tremendous interest and importance, I think, in general for we philosophers who come out of more of a continental tradition or pluralists, which I guess I consider myself to be a pluralist as much as anything. And that is that people like Deleuze and other continental philosophers paid attention when Gödel pointed out that there's no ultimate foundation for mathematics, and that it's what turtles all the way down, we can say, okay? And by contrast, the analytics, people, not as much Frege, although Frege did it to some extent too, but certainly Russell, who tried to just bury Bergson and Merleau-Ponty and other continental philosophers tried to destroy them at a conference held in France in 1958, because they wanted to insist, right, on some absolute notion of truth in spite of the revelations of uncertainty and of Gödel's claim, it wasn't just a claim, but proof that there is no ultimate foundation for logic, which is why, you know, the Principia Mathematica is 800 pages, 600 of which are devoted to proving 1 + 1 is 2, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a deeper underlying question, and that question is, which is more privileged? And that is a question of geometry, as opposed to something like set theory or other mathematical theories. Bye, Clara. Mathematical. One of the reasons that Bergson, Husserl were married by the analytics was because of their privileging of geometry. And so it's very interesting that, you know, dynamical systems theory becomes so prevalent and such an important element in Deleuze's work. And also, I have found it there in Hannah Arendt's work, which was one of the original things that keyed me made me aware of the ways in which she and Deleuze reflect each other in important ways. So there is that element, right? So the question is, if there is no ultimate foundation for truth, then how do we find ways, right, to deal with what Arendt calls, you know, matters of fact, or states of affairs, as Deleuze would call them, which is actually an analytic term. And how do we deal with the idea, right, that reference always, that ultimately reference means a true proposition and a false proposition, which is something that we cannot ultimately ground. So then the question is, well, then what tools are left to us? And I don't see people like, you know, philosophers like Deleuze falling into what they're usually accused of, which is being relativistic with regard to truth and falsity. I think that they're really struggling and very focused on the question, right, of how, under what conditions can we make statements? And what is the status of those propositions? And how are we to understand, right, the status of those propositions in relationship to states of affairs or bodies and their affective dimensions? So this is a true and honest struggle of the philosophers that we're dealing with, which I respect very much. So that's the, you know, truth question. And, you know, different philosophers of the era deal with it in different ways. I think Deleuze's logic of sense, and also his work, the chapter on logic in What is Philosophy, both of these are his, and the second one with Guattari, you know, the manner in which he is trying to approach this problem and find a way of speaking about things without making the kinds of truth claims that have clearly been ruled out, but not simply sort of, you know, which is why we're focusing on concepts, and metaphors have to be ruled out from the start. And that's why conceptualization becomes so important, because it's not metaphorical, right? It's not connotation. It's conceptual. And we can always change our minds. We can create new concepts. We can redefine concepts. We can work with concepts in various different ways, but we need conceptualization rather than trying to pretend that it's possible to have true propositions and false propositions, or as Hannah Arendt says, well, you know, the logical truth claim in syllogistic logic, that's easy. That's not an issue, but it has no hold, right? It doesn't take us any further than all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Yeah, so the circularity of the linguistics, of the analytics, is what I think that he was after. And that goes back to your first question. I don't remember seeing him talk about Bourbaki anywhere, but I know that throughout his work, and I have focused on this extensively, he's heavily engaged with Russell and Frege. And I think you need to have a very good understanding of Russell and Russell's paradoxes and Russell's account of logic, and also Frege's account of language, in order to understand the manner in which, right, Deleuze is saying, I'm not going to follow them in their structure because I don't want to create another linguistics, because that ties me to truth value that no longer holds, that I cannot find, right, a proper ground for. So then the question is, how can we speak? And therefore that becomes, again, as I said before, the importance and the value of concepts. I would also point out that I think he uses the work of Charles Peirce in this everywhere in his work, as early as Difference and Repetition. I'm not talking about the cinema books at all. I'm talking about the manner in which Deleuze's idea of generalization is Peirce's notion of continuity, or the super multitudinous events, or you could call them points if you want to use a mathematical structure, out of which reality arises, which then gets interpreted, which then that interpretation becomes part of the overall generalization. Again, the super multitudinous number of concepts, if you will. So I think he uses Peirce as well to point out the manner in which we construct concepts, right? And he reinterprets Plato using that model, by the way, right? So justice is the generalization, that's Peirce's firstness, and the individual event, a just act, that's Peirce's secondness, that's the brute reality. And then the third element is the application of justice, which is interpretation. And then that interpretation re-enters, right, the social and cultural field, or the world field, if you will, to be, right, recycled again. I see my Persians there shaking their heads. Thank you. So, you know, there are many, I think he uses every possible way, everything he can to get at this. And the accusations of, you know, the post-structuralist, postmodernist philosophers in general as relativists is just, it's just so untrue, and it's so wrong, and it's, you know, just so pathetic. The problem is insisting on absolute truth when mathematically and scientifically none are available, which is different from the question of determinism, mathematically and even scientifically, which is something I've been working on this week. But nevertheless, it is still crucial for what I think Deleuze's work on language is about. So I hope I answered that.
Thank you very much for that. Βάρσος. Γιώργο, I think the ball is
Και
still in.
μήπως μπορώ να προηγηθώ του Βάρσου, γιατί αυτό που θα πω έχει σχέση με ό,τι είπε πριν, αν ο Γιώργος μου δώσει την άδεια, ιδάλλως θα περιμένω να μιλήσω μετά από αυτόν.
Όχι, όχι. Ναι, σου δίνω την άδεια.
Έχεις το χρόνο
Όχι,
για να
ναι, ναι.
μείνει. Έχεις το
Απολύτως.
χρόνο. Well, I want to take you to another direction, and I think that in your presentation you trace a way out, or we could say a line of light, to the art, to poetry, maybe, and poetry is always proposition, and my answer is how we can understand that any sense aka event always subsists in a proposition and need the proposition to just give his effects when it will be effectuated in the actual. So my answer, my question, it's rather not a question but a problem, is I'd better use a paradigm that Blanchot gathered, and it's that the main event, the event is always a war, a trauma, and death. And the main event is death. But here we can understand how things work to give one part of the proposition effectuated, for example, the illness of COVID or the illness of cardiac arrest or everything, this part, the propositional part, and another part is effectuated to the general meaning of death that is not exactly death, because it is equalized with life. It's not, if not equalized, but still we can think it parallel with life. After all those years, I remember how Takis rightly pointed out that what I was trying to do, that the pulsion de mort is something that goes with life, it was not rightly achieved. Here, the question is how works effectuation and counter-effectuation to give finally the sense, the Noima, that is already in the sense, but in the same time prepares what will be next. It's a mixture of questions, but I would like to hear you on what is the meaning of effectuation and counter-effectuation, actually.
I think I would address it in terms of, what Arendt said about thinking as, for the philosopher, equated in a sense with death, right? Because it's a removal from the world. And I think that it's the same for Deleuze, right? That it's, and so there's this constant, there's for anyone who thinks, right? There's this constant quality, which is death, in the sense of removal from the world, as a necessity for being able to say anything, to speak at all, to write, to create. I'm also thinking it, I always think about this in a Deleuzean context in relationship to Artaud, who for me is the paradigm of this, because not only did he struggle as a poet, but he struggled as a schizophrenic. And what I find so exemplary about Artaud is that he retained enough contact with reality, right? With organized language in order to allow him to express his incredibly unique ideas, in order to, I don't know if express is the right word here, but let me just say write, present, speak, write his ideas, which were absolutely unique. So on the one hand, there are two problems here. It's not just that thinking is a death in terms of withdrawal from the world. That's the case, but one also has to have enough organization of oneself not to actually die physically. And without that, right, physically, mentally, psychologically, socially, without that, the poetry is not going to be possible. It can't be written. It can't be made. And it's an incredibly difficult thing, which is why poets, I don't know how they do it, honestly. I could not do it. I don't know how they manage it, because there is that constant disjunct between living and dying. And especially for someone like Artaud, who was so, who had that additional, issue of being schizophrenic, and yet being able to maintain his grasp on language so that he could write. That's I think, to me, poetry has to be the hardest thing, much harder than writing philosophy.
Thank you very much.
Γιώργο.
Well, Dorothea, thank you so very much for provoking us the way you did. And actually, I think I'll be just returning to the same issue that I think has been hovering all along.
Okay.
Since actually the first question, Yanni's question, where I think I would perhaps want to return after your recent answer, your last answer to Chloe, though I would tend to say, like, so wouldn't everything be in a kind of trembling, like the very trembling between things, which is not a contradiction, certainly, but you keep using those terms that are very interesting: removal from, withdrawing from, and which do not imply radical distance or like disappearance of what we could call reality, reference, experience, or whatever. It implies a certain kind of distancing, and at the same time, a constant situation of tension in between life and death, ultimately. So the notion of pure thought, of course, you have not brought it up as such. I'm not saying that you suggested something like pure thought, but at times perhaps it's mostly Arendt than not so much Deleuze, but I have had the impression that you insisted too much on this distance with respect to materiality, and of course we're not talking about being tied to or subjected to reference, but we could be talking about an unavoidable and necessary play with reference, a touch of it, some kind of a continuous erethismos, like erethismos. Could anybody help me with?
Yeah.
Arousal.
Ερεθισμός,
Arousal.
ερεθίζεσαι και σεξουαλικά όταν ερεθίζεσαι.
Arousal.
In a way, yes. When you just cannot help being touched by something and reacting to something, which would mean that this in-between things and propositions would constantly be there. That is, it would be there in the way that it is there in art and literature, especially poetry, perhaps, and of course, perhaps not in knowledge in the dogmatic sense of the term. So that, let's say I would invite you to reconsider your notion of withdrawing from or removal from experience or the world with respect to the necessity and the possibility of thinking, and thinking in a creative way.
The question that I'm hearing is the question about materiality.
Right. Very
And-
much so, and its relationship to spirituality. In a way.
And the manner in which I approach this and have since my dissertation is on, I would say, what for Deleuze is the level of the haptic. For someone like, for phenomenology, or more Bergson, for Bergson is the whole level of sensibility and the quantum level. I use that term carefully because I'm just reading something about this again. The quantum level of our sensibility, affectivity, not in the way contemporary feminists in the US use that word, but more in the neurophysiological sense of affectivity through the neurophysiology. So what I'm looking at as the constant element is precisely, right, that affective life, which is always, and most of the time, most of it, and I'm not talking about the five senses, I'm talking about the below the level of sensory perception, below the level of the major senses, which we are constantly taking in, never leaving us, never going away, constantly there for us, is us in a sense, right? And serves as the basis, serves as, people will call it embodiment or something like that, but those words are really too big. I just prefer to call it, the affective life, which is also super multitudinous, to use Peirce's term, because for Peirce, the super multitudinous is qualitative. It's quality. And that's what I'm talking about as generalization is quality. And you don't get to concepts until you're on the level of interpretation. So qualitative life is always the super multitudinous generalization of everything in the world. It's pure, it is searching for words here, so go back to make it less woofy, you know, cloudy and more grounded. Certainly I try to, in my own work, ground it in neurophysiology and in studies of affectivity, even neuroscience, studies of, you know, the limbic system, the midbrain, the cortex, all of that. I look at all of that, and the whole neurophysiology of the body goes back to Bergson as well, who did that. So to me, you know, that's what generalization is. And that's the start of every process for life. That's the source, if you will, of every process in life. I hope that makes some sense.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Does anyone else want to ask something?
Μίλω Μαργαρίτα.
Ωραία. Κανάκης, Λελεδάκης.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dorothea, for the
Of course, thank you for
talk.
coming.
If I understand correctly, Deleuze poses a kind of level of thinking where sense can emerge, in a sense, which is a distinct type of level. And if I understand also, he does not connect this level, thinking, sense, with some form of subject in relation to which sense and thinking would operate.
Mhm.
Is that correct? And can we really accept some form of that argument without at the same time implying a form of subject? Can we think of sense in Deleuze's meaning, in Deleuze's sense, without implying that there is a form of subject-like intentionality bringing forth this openness Deleuze attributes to sense?
Based on the context of what I read today, subject formation is an effect of the manner in which a vector field is filled by all the trajectories, right, that cross it. And those trajectories are a question of course, what is the starting point? What is the attractor point? How many trajectories are going through the field? Where are they? Where are they arising? In what context? In what world? So for Deleuze, my understanding is that subject formation would always be an effect and not a starting point. If that's what you're asking, if I'm understanding your question. And that's why rather than talk about specific persons, for example, he talks about personae, right? The personae who we use the name of Descartes to refer.
Φαίνεται να έχει κολλήσει.
Στα αγγλικά.
Dorothea, can you hear us?
You seem stuck.
The image is frozen.
Can anyone hear the
Οι υπόλοιποι ακούτε, δηλαδή.
Μπορείτε.
Ναι, οπότε μόνο
Όχι,
το Dorothea.
την έχουμε χάσει.
Ναι, θέλω να πω ότι
Ναι,
μεταξύ
ναι.
μας, ναι, οκ. Άρα είναι της Dorothea το...
Λοιπόν, Αντώνη, δεν συνεχίζεις μέχρι να ξανάρθει η Δωροθέα? Ένα λεπτό.
Πώς ακριβώς?
Όντας γινόμενος Δωροθέα, γίνε.
Εγώ ήθελα να ρωτήσω πράγματα, να την πάω την κουβέντα. Τώρα, άμα θέλετε, μπορούμε
Ναι.
να έχω κάποιες σκέψεις για... Δηλαδή τώρα αυτό που ρωτήθηκε ήταν πολύ σχετικό. Δηλαδή μόλις είπε τη λέξη attractor, χτύπησε καμπανάκι γιατί την είχα ήδη γραμμένη για να τη ρωτήσω σχετικά με το attractor. Οπότε να πω τη σκέψη μου και να το συζητήσουμε, επειδή νομίζω ότι κολλάει. Σε κάποια φάση, τώρα ελπίζω να είναι και ο Χρήστος, οπότε μόλις δει ότι μπαίνει η Δωροθέα πάλι στο chatroom, γιατί εγώ δεν έχω πρόσβαση, δεν είμαι ο administrator, να μπει. Θες να την πάρεις ένα τηλέφωνο?
Ναι, τώρα η Δωροθέα να ενημερώσω απλά ότι έχει φύγει εκτός τελείως, βγήκε.
Ναι.
Έφυγε, ναι, και επίσης δεν υπάρχει waiting room, άρα όταν μπει θα μπει πάλι αυτόματα, κατευθείαν.
Τέλεια. Τέλεια.
Περιμένουμε.
Ωραία,
Αν
θες
μπορείτε να
να
επικοινωνήσετε και μαζί της. Ναι.
Έχω τηλέφωνο, θες να την πάρεις? Ωραία. Ωραία. Λοιπόν, σε κάποια φάση μας είπε ότι οι προτάσεις είναι εμενώς συνδεδεμένες μέσα από διαφορετικές σχέσεις και ότι αυτό μας το κάνει ξεκάθαρο για να κάνει μια διαστολή με αυτό που αποκάλεσε transcendental unity. Και σκεφτόμουν κατά πόσο το να δούμε εμενώς τις προτάσεις ενωμένες έρχεται σε αντιδιαστολή με το Transcendental Unity, δεδομένου του ότι ο Deleuze ήταν ένας Transcendental Empiricist. Δηλαδή, δεν υπάρχει κάποιο είδους attractor, ενδεχομένως όπως υπάρχει το vector field, κάποιος attractor κάπου στη μέση της σφαίρας, αν είναι σφαιρικό το field, το πεδίο, που να τραβάει κατά κάποιο τρόπο τις συγκεκριμένες προτάσεις μεταξύ τους και να τις φέρνει μαζί. Δηλαδή, γιατί να ενωθεί η α πρόταση με τη β πρόταση εμενός, αν δεν υπάρχει κάτι το οποίο τα κάνει και τα δύο attract, το οποίο είναι transcendental. Γιατί από τη στιγμή που έρχονται όλα αυτά μαζί, δημιουργούν κάτι το οποίο ξεφεύγει από την εμένεια. Είμαι λάθος να έχω την αίσθηση ότι μήπως δεν είναι αντίθετα αυτά τα δύο πράγματα, αλλά συμπληρωματικά, και ότι ενδεχομένως ο λόγος που δίνουμε έμφαση στην εμένεια, στο εμενές κομμάτι, είναι γιατί για πολλά χρόνια δίνεται έμφαση στο transcendental κομμάτι. Αυτό ήθελα να ρωτήσω. Και επειδή άκουσα ότι μίλησε για attractors, μου ήρθε...
Κάτι θέλει να πει ο Γιώργος. Γιώργο,
Γιώργο.
κάτι θέλει να πει, σε βλέπω. Δεν το βρίσκω.
Εμένα αυτό στο οποίο μόλις αναφέρθηκε ο Αντώνης είναι το νόημα, είναι το sense, είναι αυτό που λέμε νόημα. Δηλαδή, αν αυτό που λέει νόημα, αν αυτό που ψάχνει ο Deleuze δεν είναι ακριβώς ένας attractor, αλλά άλλου τύπου, αλλά που είναι attractor, επειδή ακριβώς, ναι, είναι αυτό που εκείνος ψάχνει με τη δική του έννοια του νοήματος, του logique du sens. Ένας attractor άλλου τύπου όμως, και όχι από εκείνους που συγκροτούν παγιωμένες και παραδοσιακού τύπου μορφές, αλλά από εκείνους που κατά κάποιο τρόπο επιτρέπουν και την ρογμή ή και την ανατροπή των μορφών αυτών.
Εγώ θα έλεγα ότι το attractor να μην το παίρνουμε ως μαύρο κουτί έτσι έτοιμο, αλλά να το αντικαταστήσουμε με την έννοια υποκειμενικό σκοπό. Γιατί ίσως είναι δάνειο το οποίο μαύρο κουτί.
Ναι, ήταν whiteheadiανή αυτή η επισήμανση για τον υποκειμενικό σκοπό.
Το μορφωμένο υποκείμενο είναι κάτι το οποίο έχει μια κατεύθυνση.
Και εκεί που το υποκείμενο γίνεται υπερκείμενο, ας πούμε. Και είναι πολύ σχετικό με όλα αυτά που συζητάμε, γιατί κατά κάποιο τρόπο και κάτι που μου έρχεται από την πτύχωση είναι σε ποιο σημείο το ιδιωτικό κομμάτι της πτύχωσης γίνεται δημόσιο για κάτι μεγαλύτερο από αυτό, το οποίο αυτό το μεγαλύτερο είναι μια κυρίαρχη μονάδα, η οποία έχει ένα vinculum, ένα βρόγχο, ένας βρόχος ο οποίος κατά κάποιο τρόπο φέρνει μαζί τις κυριαρχούμενες μονάδες. Οπότε, αν δούμε τα propositions με τέτοιους όρους, ποιος και τις δένει εμενός. Πού εδρεύει, ο Γιάννης θέλει κάτι να πει, και η Χλόη. Πού εδρεύει αυτό το sensibility, τέλος πάντων. Γιάννη, Χλόη. Χλόη, είσαι mute. Είσαι mute. Πρέπει να κάνεις mute. Όχι, δεν σε ακούμε ακόμα.
Τώρα με ακούτε?
Ναι,
Μ'
ναι.
ακούτε?
Ναι, ναι.
Λοιπόν, να προσέξουμε λίγο εδώ την έννοια υπερβατικός και υπερβατολογικός. Η έννοια του υπερβατικού, έτσι όπως την ξέρουμε από τον Γκαντ, έχει σχέση με τη μεταφυσική. Ο υπερβατολογικός εμπειρισμός ακριβώς είναι το ότι ό,τι ξεκινάει από την εμπειρία έχει έναν ορίζοντα που αφορά τα πράγματα που δεν είναι γεγονικά, γεγονότα, είναι σε μια virtuality, σε μια ενδυνάμει κατάσταση. Οπότε, εδώ θα κάνω και μια, ίσως που θα την κρίνει, έχουμε την Άννα εδώ να την κρίνει, αλλά έχει σχέση με αυτό που είπε και ο Κανάκης σαν ερώτηση, ότι το attractor από τη μια μεριά είναι σε ένα σύστημα των vectors ή σε ένα σύστημα τέλος πάντων διαγραμματικό που λειτουργεί μέσα σε αυτά τα πλαίσια που καθορίζουν η μαθηματική σκέψη, αλλά από την άλλη μεριά στον Deleuze attractor είναι και όρος για το aliquid. Το aliquid είναι το τι, το κάτι, το something, που ο Deleuze το ορίζει ως τον κυρίαρχο των πάντων. Όλα, στις σκέψεις, στο συμβάν, στην έννοια, τα πάντα στηρίζονται πάνω σε ένα aliquid, στο τι, στο κάτι. Αν λοιπόν μπορούμε να σκεφτούμε με τη διασταλτική αυτή έννοια τον ατράκτορα σαν κάτι, ταυτόχρονα μπορούμε να σκεφτούμε, πιθανώς μάλλον να μπορούμε να σκεφτούμε, αυτό το στοιχείο να παίζει σε δύο επίπεδα. Είναι η έκτη σειρά του βιβλίου, η διπλή διαμόρφωση των πραγμάτων. Για να μην πω και τριπλή αν πάμε στον Μπέρς. Αυτό δηλαδή μπορεί ταυτόχρονα να λειτουργεί σαν μια μαθηματική έννοια και ταυτόχρονα να λειτουργεί σαν μια έννοια λογική ή ενοιολογική ή στη σκέψη γενικά. Αυτό ήθελα να προσθέσω. Ευχαριστώ.
Έχει επιστρέψει και η Δωροθέα. Οπότε Δωροθέα is back, so if anyone...
Αντώνη, θέλεις να κάνεις μια σύνοψη για τη Δωροθέα για να δει τι έχουμε πει?
Ωραία, τέλεια. Dorothea, we were just talking about attractors and what exactly they are in the Deleuze system, because I heard that word come up in your last answer. And basically, I had a question. I had already written down the word that was very pertinent to this issue. And while you were away, I posted to the group and we were kind of discussing on that. And it basically had to do with the fact that at some point you mentioned that the prepositions are eminently connected through differential relations. And as I understood it, that stood opposite the idea of transcendental unity. Can you hear me? Because your image is frozen again. Okay. Φαίνεται ότι συγκεκριμένη ερώτηση δεν είναι να τεθεί. Γιάννη, θες να... Έλα.
Στην αρχή έτσι το απάντησα στο κεφάλι μου, αυτό το προσέγγισα, το ζήτημα του ελκυστή, γιατί με αφορά και εμένα, ενώ το σκέφτομαι, λοιπόν, με αφορά. Είμαι πολύ κοντά στο Παναγιώτη. Στις δικές μου ομιλίες είπα ότι στην τρίτη θέση τη διαστροφική αποκτάει η δράση μία επέμβαση στο περιβάλλον, ένα εσωτερικό και εξωτερικό νόημα και αυτό έχει ένα orientation. Το orientation αυτό, μ' ακούτε? Το orientation αυτό, εγώ το αποδίδω στο αποτέλεσμα της εμπειρίας του σώματος στο σώμα. Έτσι αποκτάει ένα orientation το κάτι. Το κάτι για μένα έχει ήδη ένα orientation, έχει ήδη ένα σπρώξιμο, ένα push. Είναι ένα διαρκές σπρώξιμο το κάτι που είπε η Χλώη. Αλλά κατά τη διάρκεια της εμπειρίας του σώματος πηγαίνει σε κατευθύνσεις. Έτσι κυρτώνει προς... Και όταν κυρτώνει κάνει και πτυχώσεις. Δημιουργεί πτυχώσεις όταν κυρτώνει. Κάπως έτσι το σκέφτομαι, δεν ξέρω.
Μήπως ότι έχουμε ένα σώμα έρχεται με το έχουμε και ένα νου και μήπως ουσιαστικά όπως έχουμε ένα σώμα το οποίο βιώνει
Ή
εμπειρίες.
μήπως πολλά σώματα και πολλά μυαλά τα οποία κάνουν πράγματα, υπάρχουν μοτίβα τα οποία συνδέονται μεταξύ τους και τελικά υπάρχει και το contingency κατά κάποιο τρόπο, ας πούμε, οπότε υπάρχει μία συνοσυρότητα κάποιων πραγμάτων και άρα κάπου εκεί υπάρχει ο ελκυστής τελικά. Ποιος να είναι και αυτό.
Πολύ ενδιαφέρον. Ναι, το οποίο να είναι perspectival, να είναι και contextual, δηλαδή ανάλογα με την περίσταση, να έρχονται συγκεκριμένα, γιατί δεν βγαίνουν όλες μας οι πτυχές, όλες τις στιγμές.
Ακριβώς,
Οπότε,
ναι.
τι κάνει.
Και ίσως, ας πούμε, δηλαδή, ίσως αυτό το πράγμα, δηλαδή να πρέπει να αποσυνδεθούμε από την θέση του ενός εξωτερικού ή μιας εξωτερικής παρατηρήτριας και να μπούμε μέσα σε όλο αυτό, το οποίο είναι πολύ χαοτικό και που γίνονται πράγματα, αλλά γίνονται ενδεχομένως παράλληλα πράγματα. Δεν είναι μόνο ένα πράγμα που γίνεται, αλλά γίνονται παράλληλα και κάποιες φορές αυτά τα παράλληλα έρχονται και όταν έρχονται, εκεί είναι που παρατηρούμε τον ελκυστή. Εκεί υπάρχει ο ελκυστής. Ή πολλοί ελκυστές,
Αλλά έρχονται...
μόνο ένας, ή αυτή η ιστορία, αυτό το φαινόμενο. Είναι σαν να ζούμε, να βλέπουμε ένα φαινόμενο να γίνεται, ας πούμε, να υπάρχει. Και εκεί, σε αυτή τη φάση του ελκυστή, μπορούμε να το δούμε και με ένα άλλο τρόπο, αν θέλουμε να το συνδέσουμε με το νόημα ως λογοθετικός ρηματική εμπειρία, γιατί εκεί μπορεί να είναι, ας πούμε, και το πότε συμβαίνουν, πώς διαμορφώνονται ή συγκροτούνται οι ηγεμονικοί λόγοι. Πώς συγκροτείται. Και μου έρχεται στο μυαλό, ας πούμε, όλη αυτή η θεωρία Λακλάου και Μούφε και πώς συγκροτείται, ας πούμε, το ηγεμονικό νόημα και πώς αποσυγκροτείται πολλές φορές. Δηλαδή, δεν έχει μια μονιμότητα αυτή η ηγεμονική συγκρότηση του νοήματος. Συμβαίνουν πράγματα που το κάνουν να πηγαίνει προς αυτή την κατεύθυνση.
Άννα, εγώ κάπου βάζω το transversality του Guattari εδώ πέρα. Δηλαδή το transversality έρχεται, διαπερνάει ένα σύνολο απειρότητας. Είναι ορισμένο μεν, αλλά είναι σύνολο απειρότητας που επιμένει ο Ντελέζ στις διαλέξεις του για τον Σπινόζα το 80-81.
Ναι.
Παιδιά, να ζητάμε το λόγο από τον Αντώνη, σας παρακαλώ, μην γίνει χαοτικό. Ήθελα λοιπόν πρώτη εγώ να ζητήσω να πω κάτι.
Συγγνώμη, Χλώη μου, μισό λεπτό, με συγχωρείς που σε διακόπτω. Απλά είναι η Δωροθέα στο τηλέφωνο και ρωτάει το Χρήστο άμα υπάρχει περίπτωση να είναι σε waiting room αυτή τη στιγμή και αν μπορεί να τη βάλει, γιατί είναι στο iPad της σε waiting room. Χρήστο.
Όχι, δεν υπάρχει αυτή τη στιγμή waiting room ενεργοποιημένο. Το έχω απενεργοποιήσει εξ αρχής. Άρα, όποιος μπαίνει, μπαίνει.
Χρήστο, εντάξει, ευχαριστώ. Συγγνώμη. Ναι. There is no way.
Λοιπόν, ακριβώς για να μην γίνουμε χαοτικοί, βάζω την επόμενη ερώτηση. Προς όλους. Ο ελκυστήρας, ξεχάσαμε μια άλλη duality. Σώμα και νους, οτιδήποτε μπορεί να είναι αυτό το διπλό, σώματα και incorporeal, αλλά υπάρχει και μια άλλη μονή, ένα μονόδιπλο όπου είναι το χάος. Επομένως ρωτάω όλους, οι ελκυστήρες είναι στο χάος ή όχι? Γιατί αν οι ελκυστήρες είναι στο χάος, στην πραγματικότητα είναι τα liquid, δεν έχουν αποκτήσει μαθηματικές ή οποιασδήποτε άλλες ιδιότητες. Το τι έχει ο Μασούμι μια πολύ ωραία θεωρία για το πώς γίνεται, τι μπορεί να σημαίνει αυτή η έλξης και προς τα πού έλκονται οι ελκυστήρες και πώς αναδύονται μέσα από μια αφηρημένη μηχανή, αναδύονται στην κατάσταση της consolidation, στο plane of consistency, στο πεδίο της consistency. Έχει δηλαδή μια τυπολογία η ντελεζιανή σκέψη σε αυτό το σημείο, που ίσως μπορεί να μας βοηθήσει αν σκεφτούμε. Αυτό ήθελα να πω.
Χλώη, επέστρεψε η Δωροθέα. Θες να της απευθύνουμε το ερώτημα?
Εσύ να διευθυνείς την κουβέντα, ναι.
Yeah. Dorothea, we were talking about the location of the attractors. Do you have any points to comment? Where are these attractors located?
They are internal to the field.
Yeah.
And one way of thinking about them is to think about them as ideas towards which whatever populates the field is oriented. There are different kinds of attractors. There are some that once you become fixed to it, you cannot escape, you cannot leave it. There are others around which the elements of the field simply circulate from point to point. And then there's, of course, the strange attractor, which has the capacity to throw you out of that field into a completely new one, where there will be another attractor orienting that field. But of course, there's a danger of the strange attractor and being thrown out into another field of operation, because whatever leaves the original field, whatever it is, whether it's an idea or an entity or possibly an individual or an institution, falls into the possibility of completely coming apart, losing organization completely. So the strange attractor can be quite dangerous and quite problematic, because it has, Deleuze refers to this, the extreme of this in some places as the black hole, right? The complete lack of organization. And so one of the things I see him doing, particularly over time, is becoming more aware of the need and of the necessity of having an organization and not simply lines of flight, right? So that's where the series come into play. There has to be this constant dual presence of both determinism and indeterminism, limitation and not limitation, right? So there isn't any perfect freedom, there isn't any perfect the new, because there's always, right, there's always this relationship to whether it's representation or whether it's previously existing institutions or whether we're talking about chess and Go. And don't forget, even with a game like Go, don't forget that Go has been completely algorithmized. So even within the context of Go, there's already that duality, not dualism, but duality between the computer, between AlphaGo, the computerized millions and millions of games fed into the computer, and the human players who do use the computers to practice, but they prefer playing against other humans because they're embodied and they can they want to have the presence of the bodily signals and the bodily existence. So there are, as I said, there are various kinds of attractors. You can think of them as ideas that orient a field and that that field is constituting, you know, it can be anything, it can be humans, it can be biology, it can be works of art, it can be some kind of studying. It's simply, or institutions, but it's simply a question of one has to, but the thing about the fields and the attractors is that there is, within those dynamic fields, there's sensitive dependence on initial starting point. And so particularly, this is why Deleuze likes the dynamical system as a structure for thinking about how life, because particularly, even if there's a fixed point, a tiny little minute difference in starting point can have a completely different outcome. And that's the same for all the other kinds of attractors as well. So the initial starting point of any element in that field, right, can will end up in a completely different place. And that is what is called deterministic chaos. So the rules are there, the rules for following the field are there, but it's unclear exactly which elements will enter the field, and it's unclear exactly what direction anything in that field will go in until it actually does it. So it's deterministic because the rules are set in place, but it's probabilistic in terms of outcome. You cannot determine in advance what the outcome will be.
Πολύ ωραία.
Can I add something, or maybe just from a person perspective? I'm thinking that attractors may be points that they're reaching meaning, and in a way they function in three levels. At the level of potentiality, at the level of a manifestation, actualization, and at the level of generality. We can think of them as, like, in the level of potentiality, as something that creates a potential new way, or creates a new series of events that may happen. At the level of manifestation, maybe that it creates actual relationships in the world. And at the level of generality, that it creates meaning that tends towards generality, tends towards general ideas. And in this way, it's complete. Like, we can think of attractors as something that it's really complete because it functions in three levels. And it creates some kind of completeness because it has potentiality, manifestation, and generality. And that's why it's rich in meaning. And I think that this is the way that we can see also what you said about determination, that it is determined, but it's not also, because it has inside it the potentiality of new worlds, but also it has the determination of a tendency, of a habit to go towards a general idea. So to become a pattern, but at the same time, to be disrupted from that kind of creativity, that kind of new things that come into play, because it's so rich in meaning, that it has so many connections with different things, that it always generates new worlds. So that's how I can see from a person perspective what you were saying before.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about using those, you know, three levels of the Persian thing in this context, but I think it's an interesting idea and something to think about. The one thing I would be a little cautious with is that generalization is also quality, pure qualitative, right? Purely qualitative. It can also be understood as producing ultimately interpretation that returns in the cycle as a concept, on the conceptual level, but it always goes back for Deleuze and for Peirce, right? Always returns to this level of the purely qualitative, and then manifests itself again. The only thing I would be careful about is I don't think I would use the word complete. Right? I think that the field, at least for Deleuze, needs to remain, I think the word is unstable, and it's a question of how unstable, right? If it's very unstable, then it becomes really problematic. But a certain amount of instability allows for something innovative, something new to arise. So I wouldn't call it complete, but it's certainly, those three elements can be thought about to, as manifesting within the field. I hadn't thought about that at all. I'm not exactly sure how to put them in there.
I was thinking about, sorry.
It's probably just a question of terminology and getting the language right, and the relationship right.
I was using the word complete more because it seems like that when the meaning is reached, an identity is complete. That's something that we can recognize something too.
Yeah, but
that's why. But yes, it's
always interpretation. Always a question of interpretation, because we no longer have, we no longer have the solidity of the true and false proposition to cling to, which would make it complete. We have to recognize that there's always that level of indeterminacy, and so forced to interpret again and again and again, with as much veracity as we possibly can manifest, but nonetheless, the final, the third element is interpretation. In the most positive, benign way, because after all, Peirce was a logician, and he wasn't saying, any crap goes. I mean, what he was saying, right, is that it has to always be in relationship to the quality and the brute fact. And then we interpret those brute facts. So we do have brute facts for both Deleuze and states of affairs, Deleuze calls them, but they always have to be interpreted, and that's our problem, right? That's Humpty Dumpty. That's his problem.
Αντώνη, νομίζω ότι δεν υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις. Αν δεν υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις, νομίζω ότι μπορούμε να κλείσουμε εδώ. Δεν ξέρω αν κάποιος θέλει να πει κάτι ακόμα.
Πολύ γρήγορη. Μπορώ να τη ρωτήσω πολύ γρήγορη. So I have one last question for you, Dorothea, and you're off the hook after that. If you don't mind really quickly clarifying, how do we go from if, then to or? Like, how does this switch happen?
It's just a logical transposition. If you look in a logic book at valid transpositions of logical propositions, like it's in every logic book. And so it's just a device, an effective device for undoing the causal relation and turning it into something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
This is possible only in Boolean logic, though. No?
No, I think it's pretty standard. I think it's possible only, well, yeah, maybe only in Boolean logic, but that's because other kinds of logic, like intuitionistic logic, wouldn't need it, right? And so you're right, Deleuze is dealing with standard Boolean logic, absolutely, in this context. It's not, I'm trying, it's not one of the other, of the multiplicity of logics. It's not them. You're right, it's Boolean. But that's the logic we use for propositions. In general, right? That's the logic we use just for propositions. prepositions for language, for linguistics. We don't generally use, I mean, the Vienna positivists wanted to use the more restrictive symbolic logics for, but this limited, right, what they could say to, as Deleuze points out, rather uninteresting things like Napoleon was the emperor of France. And then you're unable to actually express anything worthwhile or interesting, to say anything interesting in language.
Can I ask a last question?
Ωραία.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I would like, thank you very much for your talk. It was very inspiring, and I would like to make a connection between creativity and paradox. So I will go back in the discussion about Gödel, and Gödel proved that in every formal system, logical system, there is necessarily a contradiction. So a proposition that can be both true and false. And this is a paradox. So how we can connect creativity with the overcoming of a paradox, or is it not connected?
Deleuze is quite clear that he's not talking about contradiction. He says it over and over and over. This is not contradiction, right? And that's why he uses these, Kantian logical constructs, these Kantian judgments, because none of them involve, there's no contradiction there. There's no A or not A. Each of them involve, right, a different version of like if P, then Q, right? Or combination and, or. But there is no element in his understanding of paradox. There's no element of contradiction. That's not how he understands it. So he's not dealing, so paradox is not defined as in terms of contradiction, in relation to contradiction.
So how
I have
is it
seen
defined?
It's
in the
defined as a simultaneous disjunction of two elements, right, that are independent of one another, but nevertheless resonate and affect and have impacts on one another, but develop freely from one another, so that they don't so that they're not put in a relationship of contradiction ever. They're in a disjunct.
Okay. I see. Yeah. Thanks.
I know there have been some Deleuze readers, not in Greece, but in other places, who have tried. It's not you, because you're coming from a completely different place. You're coming from the logic. You're coming from the logic, but there are some misreadings of Deleuze that confuse contradiction and disjunction. I have seen that. That's not where you're coming from. I know you're coming from the logical constructs that you know so well, the logical systems that you know so well.
So, and the other part about creativity and paradox, do they connect or not?
Well, I think then having these two elements, right, that are disjunctive in relationship to one another, but nevertheless resonate in relationship to one another, and they are affirmed, he says, they get affirmed. There's an affirmation of them, so that they can fully take on whatever usage we can, whatever usage that they can fully be engaged in whatever thinking or doing act that we want to engage them in, so that they fully, he uses the word, they become fully positive in that sense, although they remain disjuncts. So they develop creatively independently, but always resonating with one another. So it's not entanglement, right? That would be too close of a relationship. So it's not a relationship of entanglement. But it is that's why also it has to be still situated in logic, so that you have a structure that doesn't just let them fly off, right, into different fields independently of one another. So the logic holds them together without crushing them or subsuming them to contradiction, or where one would dominate the other, for example. So they need to be held, if you will, in tension and affirmed, both affirmed. There could be limits to how much creativity arises from that. It's hard, you know. Like I said, I think that the fields within which all of this operate for Deleuze, they're deterministic in terms of the rules, but there is instability and there's probability that allows for indeterminism, but it's not it's not this wild freedom. And I think Deleuze becomes more and more aware of that, and over time, so that it becomes much more emblematic of Mille Plateau, Anti-Oedipus, What is Philosophy, later books. I think in Logic of Sense, there's still a little bit of this sense of, freedom. In fact, it's in there. He uses it. He uses that language. But I think he becomes a bit more cautious over time.
Great. Thank you very much. I think this is a good time to let you off the hook. So I just want to thank you once again. It was really interesting. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
And I'm sorry about my Wi-Fi. I don't know what's going on today. It's just been awful.
Okay.
I'm glad I was able to get it working for most of the time. So thank you for being here. Thank
Our
you.
pleasure.
Thank you.